Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to tell you about sustainable software and the lessons we can learn from open source. So for the purpose of this talk, what I'm going to call sustainable software is basically the ability to build a software that lasts, that we can keep changing at a decent pace, that doesn't slow down. If we look at some examples of the open source communities, we can see projects such as Kubernetes. That's only 3 years old, but if we look at the pace of the project in terms of number of commits, you can see that it's not just sustainable, it's actually accelerating. But still, it's only 3 years old, so who knows? We can look at Kafka. Kafka, that's 7 years old. They are releasing every 3 months. They are accelerating since 7 years, but there's especially a peak around 2015. And of course, how to talk about open source without talking about Linux? Linux is 27 years old, sorry, so probably older than some people in the room. It's not just continuing to sustain its growth, it's still accelerating, so that's pretty impressive. And again, in terms of release cycle, we're talking about a project which releases every 2 to 3 months. That's really impressive. So what about the typical internal enterprise software? So I think you all have ideas in mind about what software in the enterprise looks like. And if you try to think, and if you try to picture the software in your company that is maybe as old as Kafka, I'm not even going to say as old as Linux, but let's say as old as Kafka, 7 years old, is it still accelerating? How big is the team? Can you sustain the pace of changes? Most likely, what you have in mind right now is a system that is slowing down, maybe slowing down to a halt, often with dozens of people who are trying to keep this thing moving and hardly ever manage to release more than each quarter. So basically, another way to put it is that in the enterprise, for some reason, you either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the legacy. So legacy, I love that word. That's very typical enterprise talk. Legacy is the thing that everybody loves to hate, although it pays for the salary. So why is there no legacy in open source? Well, first thing is, of course, they play by different rules. There's a thing in open source that is hardly applicable to the enterprise, which is that there is a natural selection. Projects in open source are essentially competing with each other. And there's things that are just not a matter of doing well, but survival. Things like best practices. In open source, you don't have the luxury to not have docs or to not have a project which is easy to get, to build, and to test. This is just a matter of survival, because if you have no docs, you have no users. If you have no easy way to contribute, you have no contributors. And essentially, if you're not doing your best in terms of best practices, you're not going to have a community. And in front of that, you're going to have users that have the choice of not using your software, which is not typically what you see in enterprise, where basically the software addresses a particular business needs and it just cannot go away and the users don't have a choice. So of course, the data that I showed you, there's kind of a survivorship bias in them, because I showed you 3 super successful open source projects, and I didn't talk about the hundreds of thousands of open source projects that die every day without anybody even knowing their names. But still, there's a lot of inspiration we can take from open source software in the way we build software in open source for the enterprise. So I'm going to talk about a couple lessons that I learned from managing and maintaining the Docker project, and that today I'm trying to apply to my own organization inside the enterprise. The first one, if you ask any open source maintainer, they will tell you that the scope is crucial. Having a clear mission statement is crucial. It's not something that is very naturally done in the enterprise for some reason. It's not often have I seen projects in enterprise with a clear README that states in a single line, this is the problem we're solving, and more importantly, these are the problems that we're not going to solve. In open source, you typically have a very clear mission statement, and you have you're trying to do one thing and to do it well. You can call it Unix philosophy. You can call it single responsibility principle. You can call it microservice architecture. I mean, for me, that's all different kind of idioms to do the same thing, which is do one thing and do it well. And you have to not be afraid to say no. This is the most important thing that a maintainer in open source has to learn. Your job is to basically triage incoming contributions and to determine what should go in and what should go out of the project. And it's very important that you not only have an instinct for it, it's important that you have guidelines for them, that you have a framework for saying no. And I think this is something that should apply to the enterprise too. Think about what's the purpose of your software and accept to say no to the needs that don't fill the roadmap. The other one is more about human organization. And this is very, very, very different in the way it's done with open source and with the enterprise. In open source, you grow software before you grow teams. One of the reasons behind this is that there's a distinction and a major difference in the way we identify the team in the first place. You have two different groups in open source. Well, actually you have more than this, but for the life of the development, you have two principal groups. One is the maintainers, and the maintainers are responsible for the health of the project and its direction. Basically, it's the people who have the right to say yes or no to the incoming contributions. It's not the maintainers who build the software, it's the contributors. Contributors are the people who are actually sending patches, who are suggesting changes, who are offering features, who are fixing bugs, who are writing documentation. And of course, maintainers often also act as contributors, but that is two different roles. And it's a role that is often conflated in the enterprise. The separation of roles is a key to the open source model. It's key for variety of different reasons, one of them being transparency. When a maintainer acts as a contributor and sends code to a project, he expects to be reviewed and to go through the same process than anybody else, and that's very, very important. So how are open source projects scaled? Well, really the cycle looks like this. You have adoption at the upper left corner. So you start having other teams using your own project. And usually when a team starts using your project, you're going to get contributions. And of course, it's not a one-on-one relationship. You're not going to get contributions from all the team using your project. You're not going to get contributions from all the developers of the team using your project. But still, you're going to get some amount of contributions. And again, contributions can be really anything. It can be people reporting bugs. It can be people writing code. It can be people writing docs. You're going to get something back from the teams using you. And as a result, you're going to scale your team. It means that you're going to hire maintainers to be able to sustain this growth and to be able to take in all the contributions that you're receiving. But it's a reaction. It's not proactive. And you have to understand that the relationship between contributors and maintainers is very imbalanced. Basically, sometimes for some projects, you're going to have perhaps one maintainer for 10 contributors. On the Docker open source project, you have about 30 maintainers and about 400 contributors every month. So it's a very different way of scaling. The team, when you think about the team in the sense of the Kafka team, so I guess the maintainers of Kafka, they're not that many. That's very different from enterprise, but that's something that we can transpose to the enterprise. Transposing this kind of culture to enterprise is what we call inner source. So inner source, from the Wikipedia definition, is the use of open source software development best practices and establishment of those open source-like culture within organizations. So basically, it's trying to get the same kind of dynamics in the way that teams collaborate with each other and the way that adoption happens and contribution happens. So what does it mean in practice? To be very, very blunt about it, it means open the code tree to the entire engineering organization. And it totally changes the way that teams behave with their own code. Because ultimately, the traditional teams that you can think of, they become maintainers of their code base. And then the next step is to encourage engineers to become actors of their own dependencies. Meaning that if my project happened to depend on a service developed by another team, I'm done with the idea that if I need something to be done in this project, or if I need something to be fixed in this project, I'm not just going to file a ticket. I'm actually going to talk to those people and try to contribute something myself. And this entirely changes the way you build software, because it puts yourself in a situation where you're not your code anymore, and where teams collaborate for the greater good and not just for the sake of their own little walled garden. So summing it up, open source has a lot to teach regarding sustainable software. Many of its mechanisms are transposable to the enterprise. And of course, it's not a silver bullet. There are psychological and technological barriers to doing this kind of stuff. Most importantly, because people are not always comfortable to open up their code and to be willing to have other people look at it and contribute to it. And of course, especially in the enterprise, but it's true also for the open source world, there's a variety of technical stacks and languages that makes contributions sometimes hard to carry. But overall, I think it's for the best. Thank you, everyone. We're hiring, so feel free to send me a message.
We have time for questions. Hey, French, don't be shy. French and European, don't be shy, right? I will have to ask the next one? Oh, yeah, we have one here. Australian guy.
Hey, great, thanks for that. When you were talking about that last slide around the issue of the idea of inner source and then opening that up to internally, especially in the enterprise, and then taking it back to what Mike was saying about Conway's law as well and the formation of groups. In large enterprises where you've got either sub-brands or different lines of business, you often have competition or siloed approaches where there isn't that willingness to share across those lines of business. How have you seen examples of where inner source has broken that down or actually helped shift that culture so it's changing that whole idea of what Mike was saying about Conway's law and changing the way the organisation even thinks about itself? Has that happened yet?
I would say so. I would say the major difference and the major reason that Conway's law, I think, applies to inner source is that ultimately the way that the teams grow is very different because the teams grow depending where the need arises. So basically, when you're going to have your graph of dependencies between services in your enterprise, there's going to be nodes in the middle, things that are very central and that a lot of things depend on. In a typical closed source culture, what you're going to get is that the team in the middle will grow depending on the needs of everyone around them. With inner source, what's going to happen is that the people who have something to be done in this product will grow accordingly in order to contribute what they need. So ultimately, the responsibility and the burden of the effort is taken by the people who have the need in the first place, which I think is very sane.
Yes, question regarding corporate software. Would you apply or manage the budget constraint or the planning constraint,
yep,
or the software that's very boring but that need to be done and you have no contributors on it?
That's a good question. So on budget, it's actually easier to track for the reason that I just mentioned, because with inner source, you're going to contribute the things you need in a different product. So when the need exists in your team, the fact that the code happens in a different code base doesn't matter. And because the need arises in your team, it's logical that the budget ends up in your team, not on the team that happens to be bearing the code where something has to be done. So that's for budget. For planning, it's also good news because ultimately you are in control of your destiny. You don't have to wait for somebody else to do something for you in order to deliver what you need. You can just do it. And that's what open source does every day. I mean, when Docker finds an issue with Linux, you don't file a ticket to Linux and wait for it to happen. You learn C and you do it yourself. But ultimately, you are completely responsible for your own roadmap. And that's something which is pretty comfortable for teams inside the enterprise.
And regarding the boring software?
Applies to everything. I don't see why it couldn't be boring.
Well, you could lack contributors because it's...
I don't get it. You wouldn't contribute to boring software?
If there is a software that needs to be done, but it's not exciting, it's not a...
I have examples in my company right now where some of the pieces that are considered to be really legacy and nobody wants to work on them anymore, we don't have a team in front of them anymore. We have a couple maintainers identified because they know the code base and they know how this thing works internally, and they are here only to review other people's contribution and to make sure that releases happen. So ultimately, the boring software becomes a shared burden of all the teams that depend on it. And the way that it works is that they contribute through inner source to get their changes in. So, but the good news is that we don't have a 20-people team to do boring stuff. We have teams that happen to depend on this thing and they share the burden.
One last question from someone? Yeah, one question here. You get it.
Hello. I'm not sure to understand well in the model the difference where the software creator takes place between the contributor and the maintainer.
So typically, what you're going to see is that maintainers are the people who have the keys of the project, and 99% of the case, they happen to be the major contributors of the project also. They are the people who created it, who know it best. But the thing is, in open source, the vast majority of contributors of successful open source software comes from outside of those team boundaries. They come from elsewhere, from people you don't know. So it's really a matter of who are the gatekeepers and who are the people actually building the software. And it's true that for the maintainers, it's sometimes the same people, maintainers writing the code. But ultimately, when they write the code, they wear a different hat. They don't act as gatekeepers, they act as contributors. And that's very important because they go through the same process than anybody else who would be contributing to this project.
I ask a question because I'm in the IT industry since a few decades, and let's 20 years
Speak
ago.
in the mic.
Let's 20 years ago, we separated the job of maintenance, which is quite intrinsically boring, from the software creation, and that lead to the death of software because people get demotivated on maintenance. Software quality goes downhill, and eventually the software die. Why this model would work today when it was abandoned about 20 years ago? Because it don't work then.
So you're right, maintainers is a very boring job and a very thankless job. The reason it works, I think today, so there's two answers. There's for the open source world and for inner source when you're applying this into the enterprise. For open source, I think the reason it works today for the major open source projects out there is mostly because maintainers are paid to do it. Something that is more true today than it was 20 years ago is the fact that there is a lot of open source companies which happen to be backed, open source projects which happen to be backed by companies which are funded and can afford to pay maintainers just to keep a project healthy. That's what's happening with Docker, that's what's happening with Kafka, that's what's happening with Kubernetes, and Linux, of course. So that's one of the answers for the open source. For the company, well, it's pretty much the same. Ultimately, you're paying people to do their job. So although it's a thankless job to be reviewing code and to make sure that the project is healthy, it's part of your duty, basically. But I agree in general that it's not a good thing to consider that maintainers can be maintainers without being contributors in the first place.
So I have a question for you, Arnaud. So you joined Vente Prive recently as VP of Engineering. Yeah. What's the stack that you're trying to build there? What's the
stack?
The stack, yeah, the technology you want to use.
So what we're doing is taking inspiration from open source and basically trying to have small teams moving fast and being in full responsibility of their technical choices. So the situation right now is that we have a collection of small teams, smaller than 15 people, who have a responsibility on one vertical of the business. So that's the thing that I mentioned earlier. Scope is crucial. They have a given scope, they have well-defined boundaries, but then they have total freedom inside those boundaries. So we have teams going with .NET, we have teams going with Haskell, we have teams doing Go, we have teams doing Python. It's fine because everything communicates through APIs, of course. And ultimately, we leverage inner source to make sure that there is collaboration between those teams and not 15 silos instead of the traditional 4 silos that you expect in a company this size.
And on the technology side, Docker, Kubernetes, Kafka?
Docker, Kubernetes, yes, all the production is in Kubernetes right now. We do have some pieces of the front office which are running under Nomad, which is unusual. And then, yes, C#, F#, Haskell, Go, Python, JavaScript, React.
Everything, right?
Everything.
Yeah, and just for maybe the announcement, but I could convince you to come on stage and talk and share like because you have also a lot of needs, right? And the technical specialists. So how many people are you hiring?
We have 300 open positions.
300.
We
So
are
you get a
essentially-
job. You get a job. You get a job. You get a job. You get a job. Right?
We are essentially rewriting the whole information system by creating those individual teams that have full responsibility of one vertical in the business. We already hired 150 people last year, and we already have the first results coming to production. But we have way more things that need to be done. Way more things that need to be done. And we're not only hiring in Paris, we're hiring in Amsterdam, in Nantes, in Lyon, in Warsaw.
So will you stay at the break if people want to talk with you about
Of
what you're
course.
building?
And yes, the slides are not up anymore, but contact me on Twitter. That's the best way to reach me. And I'll be happy to talk with you and to tell you about what we're doing.
Yeah, this guy is a tweeting machine. So please, let's thank Arnaud for his talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.